Dobro večer svima, dobrodošli na promociju knjige doktorice i profesorice Orli Fridman, naše drage kolegice. Dakle, Orli i nekoliko nas tu dolazimo sa Fakulteta za medije i komunikacije i ovo je za naš fakultet jedan vrlo važan dan i vrlo važna promocija. Ova vrijedna knjiga objavljena u izdanju Amsterdam University Pressa i na neki način pokazuje ono što mi radimo na Fakultetu za medije i komunikacije, odnosno na Departmanu za studije politike. I will switch to English now, because apparently it was announced that the event will happen in English. So we will all speak in English. So I will be the moderator, so I'm not going to take too much of the time, because I also restricted the time of the others. But of course, I want to say a few words. I've been knowing Orli for 6 years, and I know her work, but it's always something else when that work is presented in the book. Extraordinary, well-written book, a book that speaks, although published as an academic book, it actually is extraordinary political book because it speaks about who we are. And it speaks about the core of the political community, which has to respond to what is our past, what is our present, and where we are going. So it's not about past, it's about us. It's not only about memory, it's about how we create them or keep them. It's about where we want to be. And it's also about hope. I think hope is an extraordinarily important word here, that one day, those of us who insist on unwanted memories will provide our societies with tools and with instruments to make better societies in the future, to make a better future. I think the core of this book is in this sentence in which Orli, in the preface, speaks about her own path from Israel to the Balkans, and namely to Belgrade and Serbia. That this is a book about those who dare to ask about unwanted pasts and demand to know, to see, and to acknowledge the pain of the others, openly confronting the structures that enable states of denial. And on this note, and again, I will come back to the political dimension of this book, to the political dimension of the work of these activists. But on this note, I want to start this conversation with our 4 speakers. I guess we will go like this, yeah? Is there any order? No preference, order of preference, but maybe Vjolca could open this discussion. And I also challenge them to formulate one question for the author at the end of their presentation.
I go at the end.
You go. Oh yes, I forgot about you. We change them. Sorry, we go back to the initial dramaturgy. Although it would be actually better, to hear them and then you. No, let's go back to the initial dramaturgy that I suggested just 5 minutes ago, but what can we do? The day was long and the football and everything. So I would ask Orli 10 minutes to tell us, what this whole book is about.
Memory in 5 minutes has been lost. Okay, so thank you so much, Igor. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I can openly say I'm very excited to have this event here in Belgrade, and also to see among the audience very dear friends and family and colleagues and students, some students that I only met online during 2 years of COVID, some SAT students, and it's really a very exciting moment for me to be here with you tonight, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for also agreeing to be part of this book launch. I have to admit that I've spoken about this book already so many times, or in previous versions of small articles before the book came out, but it was never solely in Serbia, in Belgrade. So it's a very important moment for me to share this work. Also, above all, there's some of the very important activists here in the audience from the heart of Serbia's civil society and memory activists, whose work I've been following for 2 decades. And so thank you also for being here with us tonight. I hope that once you get the copy of the book, you will see yourself and find yourself within the pages. So as I said, I mean, in many ways, this book is a very slow memory production. It's a product of almost 2 decades or a decade and a half of my research here in Serbia that initially started from my interest in anti-war activism, and that was my initial entry point back in the early 2000s, but very fast in around 2000, especially after 2003 and what happened here in Serbia, but afterwards became clear to me that this is much more about profoundly shifting from the post-war moment to memory activism. And it took me time to kind of understand this path of what do I have to give to this society in terms of my analysis of memory activism. But more broadly, actually, I can share a number of my entry questions that kind of were on my mind when I started my own inquiry and journey from the Middle East, very different memoryscapes to the memoryscapes of the post-Yugoslav space. And in many ways, I was interested to address a number of questions. The first was like, what are the ways in which the social organization of the past shape processes of how we as collectives remember and forget in the aftermath of violence and conflict? And I took this question very broadly. More specifically, I asked, what is the role of memory activists through understanding the role of alternative commemorative events, and to what extent can I trace the participation of memory activists in this construction of the past? Even if, as where I come from or in this society, they're very marginal and marginalized and have less political power, yet can have very significant participation in this construction of the past. And of course, the role of memory activism as generating what we think of civic engagement, but also very much I wanted to look for empathy. There's a lot of empathy in this work. Can we write about it and document it and understand it? Questions of hope. How do we generate hope in an environment which is very hopeless at times? So these were kind of my main questions. I would also say that my entry point, at the beginning at least, most of the researchers and studies about these questions took the framework of transitional justice, theoretically speaking. And actually, my attempt is also to shift the discussion, and later on, I mean, now there's more scholarly work that did that already, kind of look at memory and memory studies as our main frameworks for analysis. And actually, for me, it was interesting to trace that through the research, but also how those of you in the audience who are the activists, how you began also to speak about memory and less about transitional justice. And that's a very interesting shift for me. So the idea that memory or its constructions involve labor is hardly new. Actually, I go to one of my favorite, or I think the seminal work of Elizabeth Jelena, who writes from Argentina, Buenos Aires, but also covers the whole Southern Cone in terms of memory and post-dictatorship in Latin America, where she actually, 2 decades ago, writes about these human beings who labor on and with memories of the past. So in many ways, I wanted to kind of this intrigued me to continue and develop the idea of memory activism, but farther theoretically and then also empirically. So theoretically speaking, I'll make a few quick comments, and then empirically I'll hand it on. I think a few of my frameworks as I propose in the book, and my hope is that they will go way beyond the Balkans only. I propose actually to study the practices of memory activists and trace those through engagement with alternative commemorative events and what I call alternative calendars. But to analyze alternative calendars, of course, we have to analyze the state-sponsored calendars themselves and to see this interplay that continues to shape. And of course, in Serbia, as it's being shaped still, as we are sitting here, it's a very fascinating process to trace. The second framework is to think about the idea, the creation, the establishment of networks of commemorative solidarity. And again, solidarity is a word that we should approach carefully, especially when it's in the activists' world, and yet can we think of commemorative solidarity, which kind of allows for more dynamics to happen, such as political acknowledgement of the other, or camaraderie, or alternative venues of to think beyond this idea of political victimization, right, which is very dominant in so many societies in conflict after and very much here as well. I wanted to advance the discussion about the memory activism nexus and think about memory activism as a very vibrant, let's say, arena for the study of political struggles more broadly, civic activism, agency, but again, going back to empathy and very much the politics of disappointment, but to search for the politics of hope. And I kind of developed that further in one of the chapters. Memory activism, of course, as anti-denial work, but also as a strand of peace activism or anti-war activism, the continuation of that. And the last two frameworks are as in the title of the book, it's impossible today to look at this kind of work without looking at the digital. Right, it's there, and it's in the work here of the what I call the second generation of memory activists. So I propose this framework of hashtag memory activism, and we can develop this further, very much thinking of the use of hashtag as a practice of activists, a mnemonic practice. And finally, can we think of the region of the post-Yugoslav space as a region of activism or region of memory first, as it's shared between sort of crosses borders, transnational kind of belongings and questions and engagement, which insists also on going beyond ethnicity only, and that was emerging as a very important theme. So I propose to think about regions of memory activism as something that we can take from this region and then maybe test it in other places. So just 2 more minutes. Empirically speaking, it took me time to get to this title, The Unwanted Memories, but actually this is a title that I borrow from some of the activists themselves, the way they frame your work, and particularly referring to the work that they're doing about the 90s as unwanted and suppressed. And so when you work in an environment that doesn't want to engage with your actions and your ideas, yet you find the venues to do that. And I think the audience here tonight, most of you have lived through the 90s, you know the experiences firsthand. I try to take those into the question of how those are remembered and also suppressed and forgot in the present. And those, of course, of the activists' work that insists on placing on the calendar, on the alternative calendar, certain events that are otherwise completely erased from public discourses here in Serbia. I do that through the analysis of the generational shifts. So the first generation of activists, and I see some people from Women in Black today. I'm sorry there's no more, and I know they have another event, but this was where I started my work, the street action, the silent vigils, but then very much as time was going on, I began to notice there's younger generation born, they don't have living memories of those events, and they're still working with those, so they changed the slogan, they changed the the tactics, and very often hear people say, nothing has changed in Serbia, it's all the same. Sve će biti isto još 100 godina. I actually think it's not the same, and there's nuances of change, and we can trace them sociologically speaking. Yeah, maybe I'll end with that, yeah? 12 minutes.
Suspense. Suspense. Ljudska, please.
Yes, thank you. Dobro večer. Good evening. It's really a great pleasure to be here tonight. And thank you, Orli, for the invitation to join this panel. It's a great opportunity also to engage with your work, and also with this archive that you have presented in the book. Archive in terms of theories, but also archive in terms of activism, and also giving voice to the activists, memory activists in our region. So I would like to perhaps to focus tonight on a little bit on the theoretical frame, second on the methodology, and thirdly on the relevance of the study. Igor just started what the book tells us about, and you also spoke about the book. So I think it's also important to emphasize that the importance of this book, or the relevance, relies also on the possibilities for understanding the transformation of conflict, even though we are somehow avoiding the term of conflict. That definitely the book also traces hope. The book also presents and gives hope, and also it's that hope that relates to this, as you very elegantly present in your theoretical frame, that it is about emancipatory peace. And I think this is a book that is so timely to tell this story and to show about what's going on in the region. So for granting the book in the memory activism nexus, and also to look at memory related to how the past lives in the present, but also how the past shapes the lives of the communities in the present, and also to engage with the unwanted memories of the 1990s wars, I think is of great importance, especially not only in terms of generational approach, but also of the first generation, as you frame it in the book, to relate to their work, and also to see the relevance of their activism in the 90s. So. Of course, you Orli elegantly teases out the theoretical threads, I think, in the book, and also the connections between memory activism and as a form of civic activism, but also building a framework that is, as she presents in the book, a threefold framework for analysis of the memory, by looking at memory activism itself, so that placing the agency and subjecthood in the activist and activist domain themselves, in memory of activism, and also how activism is being remembered, and thirdly also of memory in activism. This, of course, helps understand the networks of commemorations, and the need for supporting initiatives, and also for looking more deeply into what connects activists in memory activism. What are those spaces, what are the issues, and also that they are, of course, always political, but the impact that they have also in the larger, not only in the memory itself, how events are being remembered and how commemorations are being organized, but also what they tell us about the future. And here I really love the idea that there is hope, because you are showing us that there is hope, and I think all the examples that you are discussing in the book just are testimony of that. What I find really important also in Orli's book, in terms of how Orli bridges theoretical paradigms, for example, when you bring the critique of through the memory activism of the liberal peace, and also when you connect memory studies and liberal peace, I think that's also a breakthrough in terms of how that you speak across disciplines, from the conflict and transformation, where you start also your research, and moving towards memory studies. But I think this dialogic between theories and also paradigms in the studies of the present and how the past shapes the present, I think is very, very important, and I think it has a very innovative and elegant theoretical unpacking of the practices of memory activism, and also transformation of the everyday sense of what life is in a context of where still there is denial, there is no political responsibility, there are no apologies, but activists are trying to bring that at the center of the community activism and civic engagement. In terms of methodology, I think the book is very diverse into mixed methods, so interviews, participant observations, frame analysis, looking at commemorations and calendars that are taking place in person, but also at digital spaces. I think it's also a leap forward towards memory studies, more into the realm of digital memory. And also it speaks through, it's multi-layered, also the positionalities that Orli presents in the book are of herself as an author, as an activist, as a feminist, but also of multiple positionalities of activist scene in memory activism itself. And here, of course, the generations come at the center, but it's more than that. And I think it's the book is also so much of reflexivity, positionality, and also in sometimes I sense that, okay, there are some of theoretical kind of, uneasiness, for example, in terms of how you define the region, because also it could be one of the challenges, because the regions have been mostly produced and defined by geopolitical kind of rationale. But I think Orli in her book just kind of handles that in a beautiful way, that it looks at the region as something that is always in the making, but that in the making that is through civic engagement and civic activism that pushes the boundaries, and also this avoids any bureaucratic trap into what the region means, and also what the region can be that space for memory activism. Either it could be constraining, or also at very many occasions it can be enabling for different memory activisms. So for the third point, the book shows us the relevance that it always confirms that memory may be fragmented. And the book shows that. Also, the activists themselves speak how memory has how activism has limitations. It can be fragmented. There is no other way. But I think the idea is how to look in that fragmentation of memory, and how that through that process of fragmentation, what kind of different spaces of hope are being opening up. Second, so that the memory is in flux, that is not static. That fragmented memory offers potential for emancipatory peace, and that all memory is in a way in motion. So it's always in flux, and it's never static. And also the focus of the generations, I think, is very important, not in terms of age as a structure, but also generations across transnational, that brings the concept of the region into one network itself. That I think your book, as I said at the beginning, it gives this archive also in a way of memory activism and networks of solidarity and networks of memory activism. So agency, subjectivity, and also that the region is not present, the region is beyond a place that is stuck somewhere in the past, but it's also oriented towards the future. And I think this memory activism in this speaks to that hope, and that hope is always oriented towards the future. As Orli in the book also argues, that the region also cannot be understood in a national context, but it requires a multi-scalar analysis of memory production that is always local, national, and global. And I think Orli's book just really does that, and it tells us that that kind of analysis we see in the book. And just a very last remark, so that also the region is trans-border, transnational, but also to position memory politics and the importance to think about memory politics beyond ethnicity, and that this book traces continuity and change in memory activism in post-Yugoslav space that also opens up the possibilities for transnational and memory politics that really challenges ethno-nationalist understandings of memory and how the past is interpreted in the present. So congratulations for an excellent book.
Thank you, Jelena. And forgot the question.
Oh, I have to give the question now. Okay, I thought I understood that. One question would relate to more to the sources. Would you consider having examples for more broader from the region? Because we know that now that the region, post-Yugoslav region, has also been redefined, and especially in terms of, European Union, that the Western Balkans. So, if the Western Balkans is half of the region, or somehow half of the region of the post-Yugoslav space, how would that kind of feature into in the sources that you have used or the examples that you bring in the book? Would you look for more examples from other parts of the region, or would you consider the region also within this triangle? Maybe Kosovo, Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia, Montenegro, and North Macedonia, or more broadly.
Thank you. It's an honor to me to be here and to be speaking about Orli's book, and I thank her for the invitation. And Jelena has already said so much, and to use her word, very elegantly put forward both much of the contents and the interest and the achievements of the book. So I will be really brief, and I will raise 3 points, one of which can be turned into a question to Orli, if need be. And one point concerns some kind of reflexivity or dialectics that I see this book being part of, and that is that it is a part of its own subject matter. So it importantly involves in this memory activism, which is the main subject matter, also the memory of activism, which is the registering, recording, keeping trace of previous activism performances, actions, and achievements over the decades, since the beginning of the 90s, and for some feminist activisms, maybe even from the earlier, from the late 80s. And that in itself is an important point to make, that memory of activism is part of this whole story, and an increasingly important one, because keeping trace of what we or others on the same task as we are, we meaning memory activists, have done over time, and how both the circumstances change and our actions, and maybe the audiences, or maybe the channels and the media through which we address them change accordingly. That all becomes material and grounds for further conceiving of further both research and activism itself. So this book talks about that, puts much of it between the covers of a book, and I think it's that alone would be enough for a book to be a testimony, a trace, an embodied trace of so many actions that very soon can be this way or the other forgotten, because events are overpowering us all the time. But also, by doing it, the book itself is an incentive to reflect further, it will become material itself for further activism and self-reflection of memory activism and memory of activism. So I think it's a nice instance of what we can call a virtuous circle of interactions between activism and scholarship. So I like that very much, and I like this generational lens, that how Orli herself called it, a focus on shifts, but also on continuities between generations, and one and the other, and the one in between, which are not against each other, are not replacing each other, but are building on each other's experiences, but also respond to changed technological, cultural, and political circumstances in which we all find ourselves. So that was not something that I had like readily in my mind, and I learned a lot. It did change my perception to an extent. So that's all praise for the book itself, but I end up again with a gloomy pessimism that I always have when I think about these topics, and hope has been mentioned several times, and rightly so. And I also see hope in what Orli is speaking about, but still, what really bothers me all the time and will go on bothering me is to what extent all this, what you, Orli, talk about in your book, what we all have to in one way or another to some extent been engaged in, concerns some kind of social enclave of very restricted social circles, especially within the Serbian society. It's not the only one. I don't want to succumb to this very Yugoslav temptation of exceptionalist bias, that there are things that only happen in Serbia, and whether be it that Serbia is the best in the world or the worst in the world, we all tend to think in those terms, or to feel in those terms better, to put it better. But still, I live here, and I have been especially bothered by the extent to which simple talk about things that happened to somebody, to some human beings, has been and is increasingly some kind of guerrilla, some kind of resistance, some kind of very exceptional, very even dangerous thing to say in public. And it's wonderful. Yeah, I know you say people persist, and many of you here, or maybe all of you, persist in doing it, but still, why hasn't, so that's maybe a question. Do you have any idea how have we come to the point where something that concerns ethics and morality, for me, ethics is a continuous reference to universality. So it's not moral if you fight for your own interest. If you transcend something that is particularistic, that is only, that goes, profits you and your family and or your neighborhood, it's very doubtful that that can be called a moral action. So to my understanding, morality must include some kind of universalizing drive. And if we think about the victims of others in an ethnic and national sense, but still human beings still, that's a drive towards universalization. And that is received by the great majority of the Serbian society as an immoral action, as a treason of your own community, as automatically it is associated with being paid by someone. So you don't do it for moral reasons, you do it because you're paid for that. That's almost automatic, and it has always been this kind of response, this kind of interpretation has always been with us, but it is, instead of like becoming less powerful, it is becoming more powerful, or like overpowering. And I really wonder, it's such a simple thing that, you know, for me it's actually simple, but I also tend to forget how simple it is, that cannot be a moral response, that response, you're doing only that because you are paid for, cannot be an assertion of a superior moral attitude. And so many people just think that way. So my questions to you are, have you any, if we forget about hope for a moment, I don't urge you to forget about it longer than a second, but just how have we come to that point? And the concomitant questions, what would you advise all of us to do with this not always so silent majority? Sometimes they're silent, but parts of it are very loud. Do we negotiate with them? Do we try to find a common ground? I don't know what. 20 years ago, I thought Christianity would be one, or the alleged heroic deeds of our Serbian ancestors in some liberation wars could be, you know, the language that we could use to impart this kind of message, to convey the message. So do we try to negotiate or not? Is it a truly compromise? I don't know the English equivalent of that. And also related to that, do you think at this moment, and in talking about Serbia, is it more efficient to work or to attack, not necessarily in conflictual, to work towards state or civil society? Because I cannot choose which one is less friendly or which one I like less. What we hoped to be civil society, worthy of the name, turned into uncivil society for the most part. So I think worst aggression can be found in openly or maybe whatever, be they really independent or not, but you know what I mean. So many groups define themselves as civil society groups, are on the other side, very much on the other side, and ready to, you know, beat us up. So do we, who is our target either for negotiation or for confrontation, the primary one? Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak about your book, Orli. It is indeed a privilege, and as someone who directly works with Orli, I'd like to start by saying that Orli has been my own mentor and really a role model of a professional and an academic. And she introduced the field of memory studies to me, and I think the passion she has for memory studies, memory activism, stimulated my own interest in these topics, so I'm really grateful for that. I've read some parts. I read some parts of the book in the early stages of writing, but I've also been engaging with it as a teaching material with my students. I'll raise a few points that I personally found relevant or interesting while reading the book, and probably repeat some of the things that the previous speakers already mentioned. So the first thing is that it is about the framework introduced in the book, which is the analysis of non-state commemorations as alternative commemorative events. And I really like this bottom-up rather than a top-down approach, as it speaks about the local resistance to the state-sponsored commemorations and memories, and makes an emphasis on agency rather than the victimhood. And these alternative memories, as well as activism related to these memories, are still on the margins of our society, which gives an additional value to the book. And as we also already mentioned, that it does give voice and visibility to the work of memory activism, which is silenced not only in the society, but as someone who comes from academia, I'd say also in the academia. So, and from the personal perspective, as well as someone who comes from this in-between generations, I'd say that discussions about the past are also relevant because many of us experienced the war, and those who have not experienced it, they still feel the consequences of these past conflicts, and they do affect our present life. And most of us yet have no knowledge about the wars. Most of my students have really no knowledge about the 90s, about the wars in the 90s, knowing other stuff. And even when they are exposed to the narratives about the past, then these narratives are the narratives of nationalism, enmity, and further divisions and war. So therefore, I'd say that the book has both academic and societal contribution, that it gives voice to the silenced and unwanted memories, voice to the parts of civil society that is almost invisible in the mainstream, and also filling the gap in the literature in exploring these issues. And the agency I mentioned when starting this, this talk is related to the issue of political responsibility. I find the role of political responsibility. We're looking at Dasha, both of us, I know, yes. I like the quote in the book by one of the activists who says, I cannot be responsible for what happened when I was still not born, but I could be held responsible if I do not speak about it now. And I mean, I found this so relevant not only in relation to the past, but also to the society we live in now. It's something we really lack in the society if we look at the political sphere, but also I'd say other spheres as well. So I'd say that the book is inviting us to reflect more and demand more political responsibility, but also look at the agents who are taking this responsibility as role models for change in our society. And I'd say that this responsibility also included lots of courage to oppose narratives of denial, also calling the state that keeps denying the past and also actively producing the narratives of enmity. So these are the really sound voices we have in our society, which we should appreciate and look to when we are interested in democratic changes in our society. And then there's reading the book. I had a feeling we could read it through the relations of silence, and there are multiple layers of silence in the book. So first, there's a burden of silence, and the quote says, one of the activists, from silence at the level of family to that of the entire society, a fear of telling the truth, of living in reality. And then there's the second layer of silence, speaking about the silence past of resistance. And this resonates with my own reflections on how we study, for instance, the resistance during the 90s at the Faculty of Political Science, where I teach. We mostly are engaged with the anti-regime resistance, the student protests, 1996, 1997, Otpor, the changes in 2000, but somehow there's the silence about anti-war activism, which is really important. And there's also a third layer of silence we can see in the book, which is reflected also in one of the quotes. And I'm reading it now. One impression has remained in my mind from that day, and it's the silence surrounding our action, the silence among us. So it's speaking about the silence in the commemorative events, the silence of the public, the silence among us when we marched, the silence of the policemen who surrounded us, the silence of the public, the passers-by observing us, of state officials when we stood in front of the entrance of the National Assembly building, and in general of that past. So, there's several layers of silence, and I guess reading the memory activism in the past, we could also read to these different layers of silence during the events organized by memory activism, but also silence in the society, silence in the private life, within families about the past, and also silence about memory activism or anti-war activism during the 90s, but also currently as well, we are pretending as if the events organized by memory activism do not exist, or we're trying to make them invisible. And everyone spoke about hope and solidarity, and that's something also I found very important, not only in the work of memory activists, but also as a methodological approach to research, observing it from looking at the hope and solidarity rather than constantly criticizing or observing negative events or actors or actions in the society. And I guess today in Serbia, at least, that's something we really lack. The alternative vision of the future or any hopeful visions of the future, but are rather left hopeless. So I guess including the perspective of hope and solidarity around our work would probably be more productive. And I also saw it from the perspective of this widespread distrust and apathy in the whole society. And then there's a generational lens as a means of looking at the practices of memory activists. And I appreciated that this approach, as it showed how memory is performed in diverse ways constantly and how different generations engage with it in different ways, but also how they, and this is, I guess, symbolized in these different slogans, not in my name and too young to remember, determined not to forget, but also later on hashtag not my hero. But throughout the time we see also the continuation, which I found very important as relying on the basis of the events and actions established by the first generation of activists, and also, development of the new practices of the new generation of activists, such as memory walks guided to artistic engagements and all of these. And I'd say that the new generations also add another layer of the complexities of relations with the past, which is the concept of memory of activism. And it's interesting how they also engage with these memories in shaping their own work. And then there's the final, I guess, point is related to the region of memory and the online commemorations. And I guess that's, my thoughts about this were very similar to what Vjolca mentioned. And when we think about the region, or at least, from my political science perspective, it is mostly constructed in geopolitical terms, so the symbol would be Western Balkans, right? And the processes of EU integration, but also how the West perceives this region, while Orli's book is offering a different version of understanding the term region, which is inviting us to see through the eyes of solidarity rather than enmity, and through the, I guess, local vision as well, rather than through the eyes of the international community, and trying to find ways of similarity between us and what connects us rather than what divides us. And at the same time, while giving this perspective, the book also points to something I'd say is important, and they are separate struggles. And I found this very important. So there's, we have the left, we have anti-war activism of the 90s, but we also have the anti-regime activism in the 90s. We have memories, so anti-fascism, memories of the Second World War. We have those Yugo-nostalgics, so looking at the Yugoslavia as a potential for a better future, but these different resistances, these different struggles, do not work together somehow, do not engage together, do not engage to each other, do not communicate to each other. And if we are looking towards the future, I'd say thinking about solidarity in these different terms, in these different fights and these struggles would be very important. And so finally, and there's the question that I should be asking, it relates to the audience and something that you also mentioned, to the audience and the context. You introduced very briefly the audience in the book. I found it when you compared women in black who organized their commemorations on the Republic Square and then comparing it to the new generations, the Youth Initiative, who are trying to send a more direct message to politicians by changing the location to the National Assembly. But you do also organize events in Knez Mihailova and other places in town, I know this. But this was mentioned in the book, and I wondered, while memory activists certainly affect the perceptions or our engagement and our understanding of the past, I was interested whether your work and your research somehow showed also how the audience affects their work, who is their intended audience, why do they in different events address different audiences and how they engage with audiences. And that's the issue of engaging broader audience. So challenges, and that's also, I guess, a question you could answer, is reaching a more new people, extending the circles of participation, and I guess that will be another important aspect of looking at memory activists, and also how the work of memory activists is shaped by the context. So not everything is the same, as you said, but the context has changed from the 90s until today so many times in so many different ways, and how does that affect also their strategies and tactics. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and I'm very glad and delighted that we are speaking in the space of Youth Initiative for Human Rights. This is also one of the, one of the results of our work, and how we also perceive our work to create some spaces, and maybe this physical space is also one of the spaces and the regions of memory to share and to reflect on all of these issues. First, I need to say, and generally speaking, I'm very delighted that I actually, when I read the book, that was basically like the history of the work of all of our organization, and especially Youth Initiative for Human Rights, because there is a lot of streams that I recognize the discussion internally in our office, who actually was present in the book. So from some ad hoc events that we organized, through some very planned advocacy or online commemorative activities. So this is basically like history of the work of our organization so far, and I'm delighted that this work is very well recognized, of course, with a lot of talks with Orli, and in a lot of talks who was not interviewed. It was like some kind of healing talks, not only with me, but also with the whole staff of Youth Initiative since 2015 until this year. And generally, speaking about these terms of hope, solidarity, I would call what's my perception is that the whole book is like the call for the next upgraded action in case and in the path toward the how to actually break the not only denial and the glorification of our criminals, but how to these ethnocentric victimhood approach break. And this is one of these tools that Orli Fridman actually present through the book. This is the frame of the regions of the memory, which I see as a framework for all of practitioners to rethink some kind of, as I see, asymmetric dealing with the past. It means that what we also through the work of Youth Initiative try to pioneering somehow. One of these events and memory tours are explained very well in the book. That was one of occasion in 2019 when we organized memory tour from Ovčara to Zagreb and then to around the Knin. So in the August when it's anniversary of Operation Storm, and then go back to Jasenovac and then to Belgrade. That was some kind of our response to these very, of course, very powerful state-sponsored agenda, in this case from Serbia and Croatia, who is actually trying to neglect all of these marginalized positions that we need to somehow catch up and try to explain. The second thing that I want also to discuss as previous speakers is that relations between memory activism and memory of activism. This is also very well recognized, the power of the reflective position on the previous on the history of memory practices in the last 2 or 3 decades, and how these reflection on what's happened, for example, on events of Humanitarian Law Center, Women in Black, how these things actually improve also work of activists of Youth Initiative for Human Rights, but also other individual acts, like we can also rethink about our joint try to remove mural of Ratko Mladić in the center of Belgrade, and how this is imposed to something else right now, and thinking about the strategies how to deal with that. And the second point, which is also I think it's very valuable to emphasize, this is about these connections between online and physical activism, and how it's very important to in these times of how they bureaucratically call that shrinking space for civil society, how it's still important to be visible on the streets, but then to also this book call for basically rethinking of the strategies how to promote that image from the street, from the public space into online space. And I'm glad that one of these, our attempts to this issue was recognized as, and we was discussing a lot about the portal, so website War in Serbia, how we develop it. And these 3 points, I would say, need to be in minds if we want to break the denial, the silence, but also to think how to actually translate the knowledge from these region of the memories to some broader audience, like Jelena said. And on the end, my question will be for Orli: which interview was the funniest with the memory activists?
Thank you, all speakers, for your really insightful comments. We have a book that is not only academically relevant, but it's actually inspiring. And I will now call you for a great applause to the person who brought us all here, Orli Fridman.